Emotional dependency doesn't announce itself. It forms quietly, in the ordinary rhythm of closeness, and by the time you recognize it, the structure is already built. Most men don't see it happening because it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like intimacy. It feels like progress. It feels like finally being understood. But what's actually happening is a transfer of weight. You're handing over the management of your emotional state to another person, and you're doing it willingly, repeatedly, until you can no longer carry it yourself. This is not about weakness. This is not about a lack of masculinity or strength. This is about a psychological process that unfolds the same way in thousands of relationships, and the men it affects rarely see it coming because the early stages feel correct. They feel like love. They feel like partnership. And that's exactly why it works. The dependency forms inside the experience of connection, disguised as closeness, and by the time it's established, walking it back feels impossible. The pattern is always the same. A man meets someone who makes him feel seen, not admired, not impressed, but seen. She asks questions no one else asks. She notices things no one else notices. She remembers details about his day, his thoughts, his frustrations. And in those moments, something shifts. He starts to orient himself around her presence. Not consciously, not dramatically, just subtly, consistently, until her attention becomes the reference point for how he feels about himself. This is where it begins, not in some catastrophic moment of surrender, but in the small, repeated exchanges where his emotional state starts to depend on her response. He says something, and he waits. He shares something, and he watches her face. He makes a decision, and he checks in. At first, this feels like care. It feels like valuing her opinion. But over time, it becomes something else. It becomes a need for her validation before he can settle into his own sense of stability. And once that need is in place, the dependency is forming. Most men don't realize how much of their internal regulation has shifted outward until something disrupts the flow. A delayed text, a distracted response, a moment where she's emotionally unavailable, and suddenly he's thrown off. Not just disappointed, not just frustrated, destabilized, because somewhere along the way, her presence became the thing that tells him he's okay. And without it, he's not sure how to recalibrate. This is not about being needy in the traditional sense. This is about outsourcing the function of emotional grounding to another person. And it happens slowly enough that it feels natural. You start checking your phone more often. You start planning your mood around her availability. You start feeling a low-grade tension when she's quiet or distant, and a relief when she engages again. And none of this feels like dependency. It feels like being in love. It feels like connection. But what's actually happening is you're building a system where your emotional baseline is now tied to her behavior. The problem is that this system is fragile. It works as long as she remains consistently available, engaged, and responsive. But the moment her attention shifts toward her own stress, her own needs, her own life, the system breaks down. And when it does, you don't feel like a man who's temporarily disconnected from his partner. You feel lost. You feel anxious. You feel like something fundamental is wrong, and you can't name it because you don't realize you've been depending on her to manage something you used to manage yourself. This is how emotional dependency forms, not through one decision, but through 1,000 small moments where you hand over a piece of your internal stability and never take it back. And the reason it's so effective, the reason it goes unnoticed, is because it's reinforced by positive experiences. Every time she comforts you, every time she validates you, every time she helps you make sense of your own feelings, the dependency deepens because it works. It genuinely makes you feel better, and so you keep returning to it, and the pattern strengthens, and eventually you can't imagine functioning without it. Men who end up in this position often describe the same thing. They say they didn't see it coming. They say they thought they were just being open, vulnerable, emotionally available. And they were. But they were also, without realizing it, making her the center of their emotional ecosystem. And once that happens, everything else starts to bend around it. Your friendships become secondary. Your hobbies lose priority. Your sense of purpose starts to blur because the thing that makes you feel most stable, most alive, most certain is her attention. And when you have it, everything else feels manageable. And when you don't, nothing does. This is not something that only happens to a certain type of man. This is not about insecurity or trauma or a broken past. This happens to men who are capable, competent, self-sufficient in every other area of their lives. Because emotional dependency doesn't form in the places where you're weak. It forms in the place where you're open. It forms in the space where you've allowed someone close enough to matter. And once they matter, once their presence affects your internal state, the dependency has a foothold. The other part of this, the part that makes it so hard to reverse, is that she often doesn't realize what's happening either. She's not deliberately creating this dynamic. She's responding to your openness with care, with attention, with emotional labor. And in doing so, she's becoming the structure that holds you up. But she didn't sign up to be that structure. She signed up to be a partner. And over time, the weight of that role becomes too much. She starts to pull back, not because she doesn't care, but because she can't sustain it. And when she does, you don't interpret it as her needing space. You interpret it as rejection, as withdrawal, as proof that something is wrong. And that's when the real damage starts. Because now you're not just dependent, you're reactive. Every time she's distant, you reach for her. Every time she's quiet, you ask what's wrong. Every time she needs time to herself, you feel it as abandonment. And none of this is conscious. None of this is manipulative. It's just the natural consequence of a system where your emotional regulation is tied to her presence. And the more you reach, the more she pulls back. And the more she pulls back, the more destabilized you become. And the cycle accelerates. This is the part most men don't see until it's too late. They think the problem is her distance. They think the problem is her lack of effort, her emotional unavailability, her unwillingness to meet them halfway. But the actual problem is that the system was never sustainable. You cannot outsource your emotional stability to another person and expect that system to hold. It will always collapse. The only question is when. And by the time you realize what's happened, the relationship is usually in a state where it can't be repaired. Because she's exhausted. She spent months or years feeling like your emotional anchor, and now she's resentful. And you're confused because from your perspective, you were just being close. You were just being vulnerable. You were just loving her. But from her perspective, you were depending on her in a way that made the relationship feel like a job. And once that dynamic is in place, it's almost impossible to undo. The psychological mechanism behind this is simple. When you repeatedly turn to someone else to regulate your emotions, your brain stops doing it on its own. This is not metaphorical. This is how neural pathways work. The more you rely on an external source for emotional stability, the less you practice internal regulation. And over time, that skill atrophies. Not completely, but enough that when the external source is gone, you don't know how to recalibrate. You don't know how to sit with discomfort, process it alone, and come out stable on the other side, because you've been outsourcing that process for so long that it's no longer automatic. This is why men in this position often describe feeling like they've lost themselves. Because in a very real sense, they have. Not their identity, not their personality, but their ability to self-regulate. And that loss doesn't feel like dependency. It feels like love. It feels like she's the only one who really gets you. And that belief, that feeling, is exactly what keeps the dependency in place. The hardest part about this is that the early stages feel so right. When you first start leaning on her emotionally, it's a relief. It's a release. Maybe you've spent years keeping everything internal, managing your own stress, your own doubts, your own frustrations. And now, here's someone who actually cares, someone who wants to hear it, someone who helps. And so you share more. You open up more. You let her in, and it feels like growth. It feels like healing. And maybe it is in the beginning. But somewhere along the way, it crosses a line. It stops being about sharing and starts being about needing. And by the time you notice, the line is long behind you. There's a specific moment that happens in a lot of these relationships, and men almost never see it as significant until later. It's the moment when she stops asking how you're doing and starts assuming she already knows. Not because she's arrogant, but because you've made her so central to your emotional life that she's internalized the role. She's become the person who checks in, who soothes, who stabilizes. And once that role is established, it's hard for either of you to step out of it. You keep turning to her because it works. She keeps responding because she cares. But the dynamic is no longer reciprocal. It's functional. And functionality, over time, breeds resentment. This is not about blame. This is not about one person doing something wrong. This is about a process that happens naturally when emotional boundaries are unclear and when one person becomes too central to the other's sense of stability. And it happens more often than people realize, because most men are never taught how to recognize it. They're taught to be strong, to be self-sufficient, to not need anyone. And then they're told to be vulnerable, to open up, to let someone in. But no one explains the difference between healthy emotional intimacy and dependency. No one explains that you can share your life with someone without making them responsible for your emotional state. And so men end up in relationships where they've unknowingly constructed a system that can't survive disruption. And when the disruption comes, when she needs space, when she pulls back, when life gets hard and she can't be available in the way you've come to expect, you're left scrambling. You're left feeling like the ground beneath you has disappeared. And you don't understand why, because you thought that this was what closeness was supposed to feel like. The truth is that emotional dependency forms in the gap between what you're feeling and what you're able to process on your own. And for a lot of men, that gap is bigger than they realize. Not because they're broken, but because they've spent years managing everything internally. And when they finally find someone they can be open with, the floodgates open. And once they open, it's hard to close them. It's hard to go back to carrying it all yourself when you've experienced what it's like to have someone help. And so the dependency builds layer by layer until it's the foundation of the relationship. By the time most men realize what's happened, the damage is already done. The relationship is strained. She's distant. You're anxious. And the harder you try to pull her back, the further she moves away. Because she's not rejecting you. She's rejecting the role you've placed her in. She's rejecting the weight of being your emotional center. And the tragedy is that you didn't mean to do it. You didn't set out to make her responsible for your stability. You just didn't know how else to be close. This is the reality of how emotional dependency forms. It's not dramatic. It's not sudden. It's gradual, quiet, and reinforced by experiences that feel good in the moment. And by the time you see it for what it is, the structure is already built. The patterns are already established. And undoing it requires more than just awareness. It requires rebuilding the capacity to regulate yourself, to sit with discomfort, to process emotions without needing someone else to validate or soothe them. And that work is hard, it's lonely. And most men never do it because they don't realize it's necessary until the relationship is over. The final thing to understand is that this pattern doesn't just affect the relationship you're in. It affects how you approach every relationship after it. Because once you've experienced what it's like to have someone stabilize you, it's hard not to look for that again. It's hard not to seek out someone who can fill that role. And if you do, the cycle repeats. You find someone new, you open up, you start leaning. and the dependency forms again. And eventually, that relationship strains too. And the pattern continues not because you're incapable of love, but because you've never learned how to be close without becoming dependent. This is not about avoiding intimacy. This is not about shutting people out or staying guarded. This is about understanding that emotional closeness and emotional dependency are not the same thing. One is about sharing your life with someone. The other is about needing them to make sense of it. And the difference between the two is everything. Because one creates a partnership, the other creates a collapse point. And most men don't realize which one they've built until it's too late.